political violence arrived here in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday night. You have probably already heard about the shooting of two Israeli embassy staffers at an event on Wednesday evening here in Washington, D.C. I want to talk about some of the reactions to what happened from Glenn Greenwald and Charlie Kirk. Before we break down those reactions, I want to start by just reading an excerpt from the Wall Street Journal's rundown of what happened so that we have a picture. And the Journal's report is very poignant, and it does create a very poignant picture of what happened on Wednesday night here in Washington, D.C. The Journal writes, "It was Wednesday evening around 9 p.m., and Ron Goldstein, a humanitarian aid worker for the Israeli charity Israel Aid, had just finished a panel discussion at the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. The theme, how organizations like his had managed to work in places like Gaza and Syria to alleviate suffering. While he was standing in line at the bar, the Journal goes on to say, a young couple introduced themselves. Sarah Milgram, 26, an American, and her Israeli boyfriend, Yaron Jashinsky, 30, worked together at the Israeli embassy. Quote, they said they really appreciated the speech, Goldstein recalled. Now, the Journal reports, while they chatted briefly about mutual friends at the embassy, another man was outside the museum wearing a blue hooded raincoat and dark backpack and trying to light a cigarette in the rain. He was pacing and looked disturbed to one observer. Authorities said it was, I'm not going to name this man, a 31-year-old activist from Chicago who had been increasingly consumed with the Palestinian cause. Now, this paragraph from the Journal I want to really zero in on because I think it's particularly moving. The Journal writes, quote, in some ways, their paths had been converging since Hamas's attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023, unleashing passions far from the Middle East that show no signs of cooling. Yet the distance closed fatefully this week. Now, notice everyone involved, the three people, are all in their late 20s and early 30s. So this is a generation of young Americans who have been rocked by people in America. So Yaron, I should say, is Israeli. People in America, Sarah American, the shooter from Chicago. These are people who have, from a generation that has been rocked by this debate since October 7th in particular. Now, Rodriguez checked a gun at O'Hare and got on a flight to Reagan National Airport just outside of D.C. He bought a ticket 3 hours before the event. So he's last minute decides to go to this event. Program ends at 9 p.m., but as people are getting ready to leave, they're told by organizers to get to the back of the room, to get away from the windows. One witness told the Journal, quote, we didn't really know what happened. Some people said they heard gunshots. They were waiting for the police to arrive. And as the Journal puts it, a disheveled and rain-soaked young man ran into the building, apparently trying to take shelter. Well, that turned out to be the killer. After, quote, people were calming him down, bringing him water, taking care of him, said one guest to the BBC. Now, the killer shot the couple 21 times, according to the government's affidavit, reloaded, fired again. Sarah tried to crawl away from the gunshots. That is what happened here in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday night. Obviously, both of the victims died of their injuries, of their gunshot wounds, and the shooter is now charged with first-degree murder. So this created emotional, understandably, deeply emotional reactions from people who remembered the couple. Yaron, we should say, was Christian, Israeli Christian, and they both worked at the Israeli embassy, attended events like this one that was at the Capitol Jewish Museum, and this is how their lives ended here in Washington, D.C. just a couple of days ago. Glenn Greenwald, obviously has been on the show, said in 2022, a white supremacist entered a Buffalo supermarket and slaughtered 10 black people. The media and Dems tried to blame Tucker Carlson, arguing his rhetoric, quote, inspired it. Conservatives found that tactic repulsive, as did I. I have the same view of that tactic today, while many have done a 180. Glenn also posted to say, which group of people is to be held responsible for these recent violent acts below? And he included screenshots of one article, this is from The Guardian, with the headline, Jewish man mistakes two Israeli tourists for Palestinians and opens fire on them in Miami. if you didn't dig into this case at the time, it was back in February, one of the most bizarre shootings that I have ever heard of. This is it got very little media coverage, so people who have pointed that out are correct on that story. Another headline from the BBC that Glenn posted: Illinois man convicted for hate crime murder of Palestinian boy. So he's saying which group is to be held responsible for these recent violent acts below. Now, Charlie Kirk, Glenn is on the left, Charlie's on the right. He posted, Sarah Milgram and Yoram Lashinsky were two beautiful young people with their whole lives ahead of them. Their murder was senseless, evil, and horrifying, and the man who did it should be punished to the maximum extent possible. But I must push back on one thing. All over X, I see claims that some people have, quote, blood on their hands simply because they've made tweets attacking Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israel government, or the war in Gaza. No. Charlie adds, I just came back from the UK. Every day there, 30 people are arrested for social media posts the government says are dangerous or offensive. It's true. Many people do literally get arrested for social media posts. Our UK viewers are very familiar with this. Now, some of the responses that I want to bring out to Charlie, because I think it shows that Charlie isn't just making a point into the ether here. He actually is arguing against something that really exists. David Harsani, my former colleague at the Federalist Friend, although I very much disagree with this, David says, no one is silencing anyone. You're just making excuses for the most vile people on the right. Ayal Yacobi says freedom of speech is essential, but let's be clear. Criticizing people like Candace Owens for downplaying the Holocaust or Dave Smith for spreading lies about Israel is free speech. No one's trying to silence them. Calling them out is how free speech works. So the bottom line is that whenever political violence occurs in the United States, it immediately becomes a political football, becomes a partisan football. Let no crisis go to waste, right? That is I think that's Saul Alinsky and, Rahm Emanuel under Barack Obama was drawing from that well, rather famously or infamously, I should say. But that's, as awful as that instinct is, it is the instinct that drives the two-party system in the United States of America for reasons that are entirely cynical and for reasons that, by the way, are entirely sincere. Now, we try very, very hard on this show to constantly be consuming, imbibing, and debating everything from every different side as much as is possible. I love that the sort of cacophony of different ideas and voices, and I want everything to basically duke it out. I want every perspective to duke it out because I think that's the only way that I feel confident in what's true and what's not and what's right and what's wrong. And the sad fact is political violence creates a climate where that just never happens, because immediately whichever side thinks that it can be used for a partisan benefit takes that partisan spin and runs with it. And this happens on the left and this happens on the right. And then, those of us who are more left or more right, I'm more right, are already inclined to agree with our own side. And when we are emotional, because political violence plays on our emotions, and rightfully so, it would be bad if we weren't emotional, we easily gravitate. That spin really works when emotions are high. But I think it's very, very important to actually pause and do exactly what Charlie Kirk did, in which he's actually kind of agreeing with Glenn Greenwald on this point. The shooter, there's actually video of the shooter whipping out a keffiyeh once inside the event and saying "Free, free Palestine." So a slogan that is chanted by many people the world over, and many of whom are not anti-Semitic. So to then say, as Deborah Lipstadt did on CNN with Dana Bash, that you cannot disentangle Free Palestine from anti-Semitism. And Deborah Lipstadt is one of the nation's leading experts on anti-Semitism and said this on cable news, on CNN. She was actually Biden's special envoy for combating anti-Semitism. I believe that was the title. To say that you can't disentangle Free Palestine from anti-Semitism, my experience as a conservative over the last 10 years is that's basically exactly what I was told every time I had a opinion about, let's say, riots in 2020 or trans medicine for children, you would be told that it's impossible to disentangle that from suicides of children, of trans children. Your criticism is categorically bigoted, and to categorize criticism as necessarily bigoted is extraordinarily dangerous because it's unfair and it gives people who are not bigoted, it animates this deep sense of injustice. There's nothing that is more taboo in American culture than bigotry, and it animates this deep sense of injustice. It infuriates people. It makes them feel like they're misunderstood, and it makes people feel desperate. And that makes the tension, the social, cultural, political tension, so much worse. So much worse. There are Jewish people who chant "Free Palestine," not self-loathing Jewish people, maybe they're anti-Zionist, or maybe they disagree with the way that this war has been prosecuted by the current administration. Maybe they simply have a different view of what Israel should look like. So to categorize that necessarily as bigotry is deeply unhelpful, because it's not true. What it does do, though, is effectively create the predicate to silence critics of a particular policy. And that is really dangerous. If we return to the example of just the last few years, cities were burned and like there were very deadly riots all over the country in 2020 because people were too afraid to actually say, hey, maybe the police should do this, or hey, maybe this is not this is a this there needs to be some type of law enforcement encroachment on this, again, political violence. And Tom Cotton wrote an op-ed for the New York Times that was called, quote, "Send in the troops." They retracted that op-ed, even though it was about invoking the Insurrection Act to quell, quote, "violent protests." So why is it a coincidence then that when people were stigmatized and literally in that case suppressed for calling for like mainstream conservative position, probably even beyond conservatives, the Insurrection Act to be invoked to quell violent rioters, that was in writing. Is it a coincidence that for the rest of the summer, violent riots continued? Is it a coincidence then what happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin happened a couple of months later? No, of course not. It was stigmatized for people to take action because people were afraid. They were, first of all, the opinions were being suppressed and they were afraid. And so this is just a point about the principle of making, there should be stigma for legitimate bigotry. That's great. You have to have some sense of shame. You have to have consensus as a society and a culture as to what is shameful. You have to have taboos. The goal is that they should be good taboos. They should be things that are it is justified to hold these things in taboo status, and bigotry is one of those things. But it's really effective on a cynical basis to expand the definition of what constitutes bigotry because it's easily weaponized to silence people, to stigmatize, shame, suppress people out of expressing good faith, legitimate opinions. And there is a legitimate good faith debate to be had about Israel and Palestine. So to take a slogan like "Free Palestine" and compare it to Heil Hitler, that's outrageous. And Charlie is not arguing at nothing, as my friend David Harsanyi said. No one is silencing anyone. You're just making excuses for the most vile people on the right. Well, no, in the context of this debate, some people are actually being silenced. Ramesa Ozturk wrote an op-ed for the Tough Student newspaper and almost got deported because of it. There are absolutely attempts to suppress uh, speech that is within reasonable boundaries, that isn't, shattering windows at Columbia University. There have been bills passed through Congress that say anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Well, that is stigmatizing. That's maybe it's not overt censorship, but it's passed with the goal of creating suppression and censorship because it can then be used as a piece of government evidence for social media companies and academia and other places to censor speech because it says, well, Congress has passed legislation claiming that your anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is bigotry. So no, we will not be taking the risk of platforming your bigotry. So I don't think it's true that no one is silencing anyone. And I don't think Charlie is here, quote, making excuses for the most vile people on the right, though there are some vile people on the right who absolutely agree um, with the anti-Israel crowd on the left. The sort of take a person like Glenn, someone who is Jewish and disagrees certainly with the Netanyahu government, and is generally supportive of Palestine. He's not being made an excuse as for one of the more vile people. David says on the right in this post, but it's true that there are some people on the right that agree with Glenn, and agree with most of the left, and probably if you look at polling, most of the country, on where this war is right now. So, if David is talking about what people think about the conflict more broadly, there are some absolutely, both on the conflict more broadly and in reactions to what happened, just the last couple of days, disgusting. There have been some disgusting posts on X, both from people on the left and from people on the right. I'm not going to deny whatsoever that there is legitimate anti-Semitism and bigotry on the fringe of the right. It exists on the fringe of the left too. And if you think that's both sidesing it, anti-Semitism is a very old and it was very old, and the word I was going to use is contagious form of bigotry, and it's definitely not confined to the left or to the right. It's very very much it has been with us, and it likely always sadly will be with us. But Israel it cannot be completely cushioned from criticism, because if you criticize Israel, you're being an anti-Zionist, and if you're anti-Zionist, you're an anti-Semite. I mean, the logic there only serves to keep people to protect people from criticism, protect a government from criticism, and the reason that we have free speech is so that these things do not. Well, first of all, because it's a right, a God-given right, but also because these things metastasize in the shadows of criticism. And I think that's something that happened on the left over the last decade in ways that were very obvious. When nobody was allowed to criticize Joe Biden as being old and senile, because if you did, you were told, like Laura Trump was by Jake Tapper, that it was just making fun of the man's stutter. So what happens? Democrats end up not having a primary, and he has to quit a couple of months before the election because he melts down on a debate stage, because he wasn't pushed out or pushed to have debates with other Democrats, pushed to have a real primary process, and everyone was too afraid to do it. So you need to have fair criticism of everything. And I think what people in David's camp and Ayel Jacobi's camp are thinking is that the speech itself that is protective of or that is supportive generally of Palestinians, so people who say things like free Palestine, that the speech is complicit in helping Hamas, that the speech is supportive of Hamas. And that argument is also really dangerous. That good faith criticism is helping the military, is helping the violent regime that is currently in charge of Palestine, despite, I mean, the polling is hard, but they don't have the support of everyone in Palestine, that's for sure. Exploiting actually people in Palestine would be a way to describe Hamas, almost holding them hostage to their violent regime. To say that you're necessarily helping Hamas by criticizing Israel or saying things like "Free Palestine" is also very, very dangerous. And even if you say people should be allowed to speak, let them speak, but you criticize them, you are not necessarily understanding. Also, you're kind of missing the actual argument, and that's also a really dangerous thing to do. If we take another example again, if we dismissed everybody who was criticizing the excesses of the, let's say, we'll go with medicine for children in the United States. This changed. The tide changed earlier on trans hormone treatments for children in the UK and in Scandinavia, for example, because they had more of an open debate about this, which means that there were kids who were hurt in the process in the United States who could have been protected if we had had a less of a sort of awful. I mean, it was still bad in those countries, don't get me wrong, but the reason it's still different here is because the debate is so bitter and ugly. And the reason that you have to grapple with these arguments when they're issued in good faith is because if we had again dismissed everyone who was making an argument against these treatments, as many people were, as just crazy lunatic sexist anti-trans homophobic bigots, then you never deal with the point they're making because you dismiss the substance. It's bigotry. Do not have to deal with it. um, and that's not good, because if you operate in good faith and say, this person is a human being like I am, coming to this issue based on a lifetime of their own experiences and their own understanding and their own interpretation, I think they are completely wrong. But maybe they're a compassionate person and are acting in good faith. Dismissing them as bigots actually doesn't even make it easier. It makes it harder for you to argue against, right? Because you're not arguing against the points that they're making. So, this awful tragedy has exposed just a painful and ugly debate. And I think it's exposed some of the double standards that everyone is inclined to have. But I think it also brings us to a place where it's in stark relief. It puts it in it puts in stark relief how and why this conversation is so difficult in policy circles, let alone at the dinner table. But certainly here in Washington D.C., where people are making life and death decisions, it's really, really sadly clear just from kind of going back and forth and you know looking at how people are reacting, why we struggle mightily to come to to come to consensus even through the political process on this issue. So thank you for watching. You can subscribe to a premium version of the show at undercurrents.tv. We have an episode up this week on the transformation of Marco Rubio. You can get that in the premium section, undercurrents.tv. Subscribe wherever you download your podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube, subscribe there, and we will be praying for everyone involved in this awful tragedy over the days to come. Thank you for tuning in.